So that's where I want to take today's topic of conversation.
So a nice light-hearted topic for the start of 2024.
Yeah. Let's just get in there. Welcome to How to Take the Lead, the podcast where we challenge the myths and stereotypes of what it means to be a leader today and help you to succeed in post without compromise. I'm Lee Griffith.
And I'm Carrie-Anne Wade, and together we will be your guides, questioning everything we've ever learnt about leadership, sharing our experiences along the way, and inspiring you to make a real impact in your role.
Visit howtotakethelead.com for show notes, past episodes, and to join our community.
Enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of How to Take the Lead. Happy New Year!
Happy New Year 2024. How has that happened already?
I know.
Where did 2023 go to, by the way?
I have no idea. I hope you had a restful festive period. I didn't find sparkles but I've bought the brightness for today.
We bought the brightness for the new year. So let's hope that's a sign of what 2024 will be like for us all. Super bright and merry.
Kicking off with some normal housekeeping. Hello to everyone who is watching us on YouTube. If you're not watching us on YouTube, you can watch us on YouTube. You can get all our links at howtotakethelead.com. That's where you can also listen to past episodes and subscribe to our Substack community, where we do extra behind the scenes, additional prompts and things you can think about post an episode, and you can chat with other leaders. So head over to Substack if you haven't already. And we're still on Insta, not so much Twitter, X, whatever it's called. We've decided to step away from that. Because actually, oh my God, this is the bridge I didn't even realise was going to happen. Because we felt it was a bit of a toxic
We did.
So we decided it didn't align with our values. So we stepped away, and that feels really apt for today's topic.
It does. I know, it's if we intended that to happen on purpose, and we absolutely didn't. But you're right. You're right. So yeah, I am. I don't know if I'm excited or if it's trepidation for today's topic, but it is something that we talk about a lot in bit parts on the podcast, but definitely a lot in other conversations and with other people. So yeah, let's see where today's topic of conversation takes us.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about culture in organisations and the fact that it impacts performance and morale and reputation, good and bad, dependent on the type of culture that's been nurtured in an organisation. And we've also skirted around the topic of toxic leadership in other episodes. We've shared some of our stories. If you've been a long time listener or a viewer, you will have heard some of the stories that we've had in our own experiences in the workplace. But also listeners have been in touch with us and they've shared what's been happening in their organisations too. So we know that it is very much something that is a live and, I was going to say but it's not as live and kicking issue in organisations. And I don't think we've ever really tackled the topic head on. And by that, I mean, we reference the fact that there is toxic leadership, but we've never done, well, what do you do if that toxicity has started to set in and almost rot the organisation? So that's where I want to take today's topic of conversation.
So a nice light-hearted topic for the start of 2024.
Yeah. Let's just get in there. And I think it can be really easy for us to describe the symptoms of toxic leadership, and that's probably what when we've talked in the past, that's how we've probably approached it. And I don't want to necessarily rehash all of that and just keep talking about the problem, because we are all about action, and it definitely does feel like something that does need to be tackled in some industries, in some sectors, certainly more so than in others. And I'm sure some of that might come out in today's conversation. But so that we're all starting in a similar place, let's define what we mean by toxic leadership so that those that are listening or watching can understand maybe the lens that we're approaching the topic today. So, Carrie-Anne, how do you see toxic leadership?
So for me, I think it's about leadership that has a negative effect on colleagues, maybe it's stakeholders, the broader organisation. And my experience of toxic leadership is that that negative effect is happening, and it's happening consistently. So it's not just a pocket or a blip. It's almost like that's the consistent way things happen around here. And I guess for me, I would liken it to being in a bit of a dysfunctional relationship or in a dysfunctional family. And it's at its worst, I think, when it doesn't change or you can't find a way out of it. So it just continues and continues. And like you talked about, that kind of rot that sets in, there's kind of no way out. So you just accept that it's always going to be dysfunctional, and that almost becomes the norm, and that's okay. So that's kind of the way I would describe it.
When does something though, and this is a question that I've been pondering over, and there won't be a right or wrong answer, but when does something tip the balance from being just poor or dysfunctional or challenging to actually being toxic?
I think for me, it's that level of consistency, that it's happening all the time, that there is no positivity, there's no positive kind of energy output, that all you are hearing is that consistent sense of people being unhappy, being fearful, not being sure about how things are progressing in your organisation, not having opportunity. So I think for me, it's about that kind of consistent level of all of those things that make up a toxic leadership or a toxic culture. So the poor behaviours, people not, all the stuff we've talked about, people not feeling able to raise concerns, but that just being almost accepted as the norm, like that's the way we do it here and that's okay, when actually there's that undercurrent of maybe not everybody, because it's almost become the accepted norm, but some people kind of thinking, well, actually, I don't think that is okay, but there's no way now to challenge that. So I either have to accept that's how it is here and carry on as I am, or make maybe some more radical decisions about moving away from it. And I think that's the bit for me as well that signals some level of toxicity. That's such a hard word to say. I thought I was going to get it wrong then. As in, like, it's those very polar opposite choices that people feel they've got to make. They either stay and put up with it or they leave. And I feel like if it wasn't toxic, there would be a middle ground to be found and a compromise, which would be about that ability to shift or change or make challenge, rather than going, right, I just keep my head down and put up with it, or I'm part of being that in that toxic place, or I have to step away from it. So that's the bit for me, I think, that signals how toxic somewhere really is. Because if it wasn't, if that toxicity wasn't there, there'd be a way to stay there and make some positive change and shift the dial. But if people feel like that's not possible, then that feels to me like that's a really strong signal that it's toxic.
Yeah. I suppose I would add to how you've defined it with, for me, in the equation, there's something to do with the harm. The outcome is harm in some way. And whether that is personal harm because of the toll of what's happening in the organisation, or harm to reputation, whether it's to customers, whether it's actual harm in some way because your processes have failed. So I think that's when true toxic organisations trip over into, from being, I suppose, just challenged or just dysfunctional, is when that outcome, I think, has some element of harm in it.
Yeah, it's about that negative effect, isn't it? That actually what's happening is there's something negative as a result of how the organisation is being led or how it is operating. Definitely, for me, I think that is a good indicator that it's toxic.
Yeah. We did a workshop recently, you and I, and it was in the health sector, and we were talking about toxic leadership with a group of health and care leaders. And one of the things we asked them to do was to rate their current leadership and how well they thought their leadership teams did against certain criteria.
Yeah.
I'll use that word, but probably isn't the right one. And we were asking them around things like, how trustworthy is the team? How transparent are they in their communications? How do they connect you to the bigger picture? How much do they bring vision to the organisations, live their values, live with integrity in the way that they deal with people, inclusive, safety to speak. So those were the kind of big themes that we were asking them to rate, 1 to 5, 5 being outstanding, 1 being inadequate. Anyone in the health service will understand those ratings. It was quite interesting when I went back recently and I was looking at what people said, and there was a lot of middle of the ground. So the average score didn't go above 3 for any of those things, which says something about the state of leadership perhaps in the health sector at the moment. Obviously, with averages, you're going to get some people who think it's great in their organisation, and you're going to have others that think it's quite poor, which is obviously why it brings down the score to the average score. But there were a couple that stood out to me where transparent communications, for example, was one of the lowest rated. Connecting people to the bigger picture was quite lowly rated. Even living the values and inclusiveness didn't rate as highly as some of the other ones. And I suppose I'm not suggesting that those being low scores means that you've got a toxic leadership team, and I'm not suggesting that this is evidence that there is toxic practices at play in those organisations of those people that participated. But some might say, particularly with some of those themes, that they're definitely not building the right positive high performance culture in the organisation if they're not hitting those things.
Yeah.
And therefore could be on the way to not necessarily building a healthy culture and possibly have some form of toxic leadership practices in place. What are your views, Carrie-Anne?
So I think for me, you're right. It's not like big rah, it's toxic. It could be a signal that some organisations or leadership teams might be heading that way. But some of the first things that I thought for those areas for organisations that scored low was, are leaders really listening to what's happening in their organisation, and are they in touch with that? And are they seeking feedback about what matters and what's important, and then demonstrating that they're acting on that feedback that they're hearing? And there was a bit for me about, are some of those organisations in that space where the leadership team is operating in its own bubble that isn't particularly connected to other parts of the organisation? And does the leadership team in those organisations that have maybe had people score them much lower have the right mechanisms in place to communicate with and engage with their key stakeholders, whether that be the workforce or anything else really? And it might signify that those things are not in place. It might signify those things are not in place consistently. It might be that some of those organisations happen to have newly formed leadership teams, for example, that are just finding their feet. So it doesn't mean those things won't happen into the future. But it just made me think there's obviously quite a lot at play in those organisations. And I think my experience, particularly in much bigger organisations, and we were in a healthcare setting, so many of the organisations that people were in are probably quite large, is that there's often pockets of really good stuff happening, but also pockets of really poor stuff. And again, it's about that inconsistency. So if I think, for example, about sort of visibility and transparency of communication, even in my own organisation, do some of our leaders feel like, tick, we're really visible? Because every week we have an all-staff webinar where a number of our colleagues can join and speak to every person who's an executive director in the organisation, which sounds really great. But what about those staff who can't join because the time of that webinar doesn't suit their work in practice? Would they be people that would say our leadership team is visible? Probably not, because we're not creating the opportunities for them to engage with and see them. So, I think there's something about it's a struggle, isn't it? One size won't fit all, about trying to create all of those conditions and get really high scores against all of those criteria that we set in that meeting, in that workshop. But I just feel like it's about the onus being leaders can do more. But I think maybe there's some leaders who are complacent and are like, we've got a few things set up in our organisation, we've ticked the box, we're doing all right, thanks, without really truly getting into the grit of it.
So in the last series, we talked about, we had an episode all on power and the different power dynamics that can be at play from a leadership perspective. And we talked about some leaders using coercive power to get what they want. So that threat of something bad will happen if something doesn't take place or an action doesn't happen or whatever that is. And we know absolutely that type of leadership creates fear, absolutely is toxic. And we know that when that happens, it does lead to people not speaking up or they become yes people. And I suppose I want to explore how you recognise as a leader if this type of behaviour, I suppose, is at play in your organisation.
So can I caveat my response to this with, you have to be a leader who wants to recognise that?
Yeah.
So I think there are lots of signs that you can pick up on, and some are quite practical, operational things that might be happening in your organisation that would indicate perhaps that there is that culture of fear. But if you are part of the leadership who is perpetuating that culture of fear, you are either not going to want to address, you might see it but not want to address it because it doesn't suit your desire to lead with coercive power, or you might not be able to recognise it because you're in that space, or you might not be open to it. So I guess my answer is coming from a place of, as a leader who wants to get to grips with what's going on in their organisation, is going to be open to seeing some of this. So that's my caveat. But I think there are lots of signs within an organisation that there is a fear culture, and some of it is about what you see happening practically. So you might see lots of micromanagement, for example, happening, lots of focus on people having to achieve daily tasks rather than that bigger picture creative thinking happening. You might only hear certain voices a lot in your organisation, rather than a more kind of different set of voices, or more voices in fact at all. There might be a lot of language or action around blame. So blame might be something that is happening a lot in your organisation. Lots of focus on, in that blame space, kind of the punishment or the consequence of doing something badly, and a focus more on dealing with what might be perceived to be poor performance, rather than looking at how you're creating opportunities for things to improve and for people to thrive. And in that space around people thriving, there's probably a lack of development opportunities in your organisation, potentially high turnover, poor retention, difficulty recruiting to roles, and particularly difficulty promoting people internally, because perhaps you're not creating those opportunities for people to grow and develop. So I think there are actually lots of signals all over the place in your organisation that there is that culture of fear happening. But I guess as a leader, it's about how open you are to seeing, recognising that, seeing that, and then dealing with it.
So there's some really good signals, warning signs, I think, for you to look out in your organisation. And I don't really think there's more I can add to that. Obviously, there'll be practical things. If you're doing staff surveys and things like that, you should get a temperature check of how people are feeling. That might give you an opportunity to probe a little more deeply in areas where there perhaps are those types of challenges. I suppose to go a bit further, how do you recognise if you're the person that might be contributing to a toxic leadership? Unwittingly, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a good question, isn't it? Because for me, I guess it goes back to that point about wanting to, like, being open to having that recognition and that level of insight. Because I was about to say, because you might be picking up on signals from other people that's feeding that back to you, but quite possibly you won't be, because people won't be in a position where they feel like they can address that with you, because you are giving off those vibes of, not being open to having that feedback, I guess. I mean, there would be something for me about, staff survey 360, anything like that, where you are getting feedback from people in your organisation, probably in a more anonymous way, that might signal that actually part of it is about you and your role and the role that you're playing in that culture. But I think unless there are people who are going to be willing to have some of those frank conversations with you, and perhaps there might be in your own leadership team, that might be a bit of a challenge, I guess. And you might pick that up if you're having coaching or mentoring in any way, that might come through in terms of what gets explored in those spaces. But I guess it would be dependent on whether you're a leader who is doing that self-development and self-growth. And I guess my worry is often the leaders that are contributing quite heavily to that toxic culture are the leaders who are not necessarily that open to or interested in doing some of that. So you posed a really tricky question for me there, Lee, because I'm not really sure I know what the answer is. So I'd be intrigued to know if you've got any thoughts in that space.
Well, it's an because as I was pondering it myself, I can almost so I came from it from the point of view that actually at times in my career I definitely micromanaged people and was probably a bit unrealistic with time scales that I set, because, and I've said this before, I was judging it against what I thought I could do or what I did at that level, and not recognising that everyone around me was different to me, for example. And so, and we've all been in situations where perhaps we're not thinking as long term as we need to. We're quite short term, we're quite reactive. And so then your mind goes, oh gosh, was I a toxic leader? No, I don't think I was, but maybe there were times when I was creating that. So there's almost that sense of probably the wrong people. And I'm not saying that I am a wrong person, but other people might be listening to this and feeling super sensitive about the type of culture that they're trying to create. And I've heard some of these symptoms and warning signs and have gone,
I do that
toxic space
all the time.
Yeah. And so, it boils down to, I suppose, the level in which you can have honest conversations with people around you, and you do it in a way that you're not sensitive to what you hear.
Yes.
And if you recognise that you're being reactive to it, even if it's like an overly, oh my God, I can't believe I'm doing this, or becoming too defensive or whatever it might be, then that's probably a sign you need to do some form of work, even if it, toxic behaviours isn't at the root of what you're doing.
Yeah. No, I think that is a good point, isn't there? You will know how you react to potentially getting some of that feedback or having some of that type of conversation. And if that reaction feels a bit over the top in some way, or it feels a bit triggering, then you're right. I think that's a signal that maybe you need to just take a step back and breathe and reflect, and try to understand what's happening for you in terms of the behaviours you're exhibiting in the workplace, which, as you say, might not be fully toxic, they might not be. You might not have done something with the intent for it to land that way, but being open to hearing the impact, and it's back to what we said at the start. What impact has your behaviour as a leader had on your colleagues in the organisation or on the broader organisation? And if that's been negative, a sign that is unintentional is that once you come to that realisation, the thing you want to do is find a way to resolve it and fix it, rather than just accept that, well, okay, that's how it is.
One of the things that I was reflecting on as you were talking was we've had these conversations before and have both worked with leaders who almost take on that who are toxic leaders, absolutely no doubt about it, but they take on a victim mentality in the way that they are treated and behave in the organisation, and they don't see what they're creating or perpetuating and all of that kind of stuff. So there is something for me about the self-work you need to do as a leader to understand, am I being defensive because this is just uncomfortable? Where's the evidence? I suppose it goes back to that conversation that we've had in other episodes around, like, where's the evidence that I'm being treated poorly or that I'm treating others poorly? And I think that's being able to see that through a more independent lens, as you say, working with a coach or something would be really helpful.
Yeah, and I do agree with that, because as you say, we've both operated in that space ourselves, and we've probably seen examples of it in other places where, and we have said this before, being a leader is hard. So we're not trying to suggest that there won't be times when, as a leader, you might feel like everything's against you or people have got, a negative view of you. But I guess the trick to being a good leader, in my eyes, is being able to take that on board and have the level of insight around, okay, so what can I do to make a change or to influence a different outcome here? And it's really hard sometimes, isn't it, not to take it personally and feel like you're being attacked. But there's something then again also about what coping mechanisms you've put in place for yourself as a leader to deal with some of that, which you can maybe do privately in a different space rather than reacting straight back to the situation that's happened. So somebody's given you some difficult feedback that might be hard to hear. It's your role as a leader to hear that and to process that and to have a grown up and sensible conversation about, okay, what might we need to do to progress things in a more positive way, even if inside you feel like, oh God, like, I feel really terrible or that's really hurt me. I think it's about having that ability and that level of maturity as a leader to kind of separate what you need to do as a leader to progress a situation or resolve a scenario versus what you might need to do as a leader in a different space, maybe not so openly, to just deal with how that's impacted you individually. And I know we might come on to talk a bit more about that sort of stuff later.
Just moving us on a little bit, when we ran the workshop that I alluded to earlier in the episode, we asked them to name what they thought the top 3 challenges were that had to be addressed in order to stop or kind of reduce toxic leadership. And what was interesting was the top 3 things that came out were psychological safety, poor leadership role modelling, and the ability to break down hierarchy. I'm interested in your reflections on those as the top 3, and I suppose what you think will make the difference about these.
I don't think any of them were a surprise to me, if I'm honest. And I think the tricky thing is that the answer to fixing them is doing the things that they've said. So the answer to creating more
opposite.
Exactly. I couldn't work out the way to explain what I was trying to say then. But for example, the role modeling thing, well, one of the ways to help that is better, more positive role modeling. But actually it's like, how do you make that happen? And again, I think it all ties back to that level of desire in an organisation for the leadership team to truly listen, truly engage and truly take action on the things that they are hearing to make a difference in that space. I guess the bit that probably it made me think about and why potentially it might not have been a surprise to me is that point I made about sometimes leadership teams operating in a bubble that isn't particularly well connected to the wider organisation. Because I think my experience, having observed some of the types of organisations that we were working with in that room and being part of some of those myself throughout my career, has definitely been at times the leadership team thinks particularly those things. We're role modeling really good practice. We're creating a really psychologically safe environment. You know, we're operating in a way where we don't believe in the hierarchy and we're making it really easy for everybody. Like, I think it's quite easy for leadership teams to think they're doing all of those three things and tick the boxes. And in reality, what's happening on the ground is quite different. So that bit for me is back to maybe what you were saying in response to the previous topic that we were talking about just now, is around where's that evidence? How are you triangulating that if you as a leadership team think that you are operating in a psychologically safe organisation and you're creating that environment, how are you testing that out to really make sure that when you're putting that tick in that box as a leadership team, that is genuine? So for me, it's that triangulation of sort of data, experience and sort of outcomes, and being more open to asking questions about those things to work out what people's experiences are really like.
Yeah. Test again. And don't trust the answers, but don't always take the first answer as the true answer, I think.
Yeah, it's like being curious, isn't it? Let's dig a bit more deeply into that. And we've talked about this in other episodes where actually sometimes even when you're testing and you're assuring yourself as a leadership team, you're taking everything on face value. So, and actually data and feedback can be represented in lots of different ways to suit people's desired outcome, can't it? So again, I do agree. I think it is that testing.
Well, that's a whole other conversation about actually how often are organisations reassuring rather than assuring.
Yeah.
But we can't open that can of worms.
Not today.
So one thing I find really interesting is that we often say that you need to call out poor behaviour when you see it. And we've said it on this, we talk about it personally. But, you know, it's so much easier said than done, isn't it? Especially if you're in a position where there is no psychological safety or you don't see others calling it out. How do you, as a leader, start to create the right conditions or even start role modelling, I suppose, in a way that feels safe and shows others that it's okay to be calling out those poor behaviours?
So some of it, I guess, as a leader is about doing just that. So when you are in a space where something is happening that doesn't align with the values of your organisation or the behaviours you would expect of people, that you kindly and compassionately and diplomatically do address that in the space. And I've had examples within my career where I've had people who've worked in my team going, oh, you know, I was in a meeting and this happened and it's really upset me. And afterwards, the chair of the meeting was like, oh, that person shouldn't have spoken to you in that way. And then those people have questioned to me, like, but that was the chair of the meeting saying it to me. So why didn't they, if they saw it in that space, and usually it's often been about hierarchical seniority. If they've seen it in that space and they're chairing the meeting and they're more senior than I am, and they can see that the way that person's spoken to me hasn't been in line with our values, why haven't they said, like, can we just take a break for a moment because I don't think the way that you're communicating is really very effective, for example. And I don't think that happens. I don't often feel like people are brave enough, even as more senior people in the room or the chairs of conversations or meetings, to sometimes do that. And they often think that just recognising it with the person afterwards is enough. And in fact, I think that makes it worse. Just after the event go, oh God, that person was really rude to you in that meeting, weren't they? And that's just not acceptable. Well, obviously it is because it's just happened. So I do think you have a role as a leader to try and do that in a compassionate way that is in line with your own values and the values of your organisation. I have seen some organisations do some basic type things like add in elements as a like substantive item on agendas for meetings where they actually ask people to reflect on how they felt that meeting went and share that into the space. And sometimes that lands really badly, but over time, I think people get used to that being the way that we operate here. So actually, I am going to reflect back in and say that. So I think there are things you can do in that space, but it's hard because people have to feel comfortable responding to that.
Yeah. And I was going to jump in and say been in similar situations where we've had similar initiatives set up for meetings, but it becomes almost an ego stroking competition for the chair because they're only really interested in what went well.
Yes,
and don't like the criticism of when things don't go well, so if you've not created the right conditions when you're asking that type of question or if you're doing it for artificial purposes and you're not genuinely wanting to learn and develop and change practice, then I take those exercises with a bit of a pinch of salt in some ways.
And I think you've hit the nail on the head a bit with the learning point as well, isn't it? It's like, how as an organisation and a leadership team are you showing you're that learning organisation? So are you constantly sharing examples where individuals or teams in your organisation have made an improvement or reflected on something and done that learning? Because that's all part of creating those conditions, isn't it? Being open to sharing that, asking the right sort of questions, so there's definitely something for me about that kind of learning environment that you're trying to create as an organisation that then makes it easier, I guess, to call out some of that poor behaviour. There's something for me about kind of what relationships are being created between staff and whether as an organisation you have space for staff to be in networks or groups or develop those relationships where they support each other. Because I also think there's an element of being able to talk about poor behaviours and what might be done about them without always having the most senior people in that space, because that can often be what creates some of that fear. So are there opportunities for people to talk with their peers about what their experiences are like and how they then might want to go on and raise concerns or challenge in the organisation? And I've had quite a recent example of that where there's been a group of new staff into the organisation and a very senior person say, oh, well, I know they're having a really great experience because they only share good things in the WhatsApp group that I'm in. And I'm like, but you're like the most senior version of them in this organisation. So they're only probably going to share good stuff in that space because you're in it. If you weren't in that space, the conversation might be quite different. So there's something for me.
They're slagging you off behind your back.
Yeah. But there's something for me in that like actually you've just got to be really conscious of all these different things as a leader and how you maybe start to develop some of those relationships and opportunities. Maybe even with groups like unions or people that represent big groups of your colleagues. How are you being open and transparent with them and trying to create a dialogue with them that feels like it is two-way rather than people just sharing things? And the last point I wanted to make was, I think often if you are already in a space where there is a bit of fear and a bit of toxicity in your environment, some of the opportunities you need to create for people to call things out might have to be anonymous in some way, because sometimes people feel better able to do it. If you're already in a space where it feels like there's blame in your organisation, you're not going to often want to be the person that has their name attached to raising an issue. So actually, are there routes for people to do that in a more anonymous way that might make them feel safer? But I do think it's really hard, because I've been there. Like, I've sometimes felt, even as a leader, felt able to go, oh, this really doesn't sit right with me, and I've desperately feel the desire to challenge it, so I'm going to do it regardless. To other times when I felt like I really want to challenge this, but I don't feel like it's going to be safe for me to do that because there will be a consequence that I'm not in a position or the right headspace to want to handle. So actually I'm going to let it go. And that feels really uncomfortable as well, because then that sits with you for a long time. So if as a senior leader, you don't always feel able to call it out, you can't expect that people in other parts of your organisation are going to feel comfortable doing that.
No. And I think that definitely goes back to that point around self-awareness and knowing how you can best manage yourself and recognising what will be in your control and what will be out of your control, and how much you're willing to accept that, or so that it doesn't eat away at you, as you've just said. And sometimes it's about recognising when you need to step away from a position, and that's certainly where I got to in one place. It was like, no, I'm ready to go now because I've done what I can do, and I've been in senior leadership positions, and have also had this challenge and this push and pull between wanting to act and not feeling safe to do so. But sometimes you're a leader and you might be recognising it in people who are your peers or who are junior to you. And then you've got a different level of responsibility in the way that you need to act and role model. You will need to have that difficult conversation that is evidence-based so that it doesn't kind of get personal and all of that kind of stuff. You might need to get someone in externally to support you, whether it's some form of moderation, whether you invest in a coach or a mentor for that individual to help them to kind of get to grips with some of the areas that they need to develop in. And also as a leader, sometimes you need to recognise when you might need to exit someone out of an organisation because they're just not creating the right environment for those around and for the greater good. Having tried lots of other avenues to kind of resolve the issues, sometimes it's better to say thanks but no thanks, isn't it?
And that's the bit that's key for me there in what you've said is that you've explored every other option to try to support that person, to develop, to grow, to create the right conditions within the wider context to be able to operate at the level at which you need them to operate in terms of, you know, psychological safety, team dynamic and all of that stuff. And I think if you genuinely have got to the point where you've tried everything, then sometimes, sadly, that is the only option. And I think there's sometimes a sense that that's not creating the right culture in an organisation by actually supporting people to exit. But for me, I feel like that's a really compassionate thing to do, because if you have been through every other route to try to create something different and that fit is just not there and it's not working, I feel like you are having a bigger impact by trying to keep that person there just because that feels kinder or less challenging to do. And my experience in that space on a number of occasions has been, it is amazing how much impact one person who maybe isn't aligned with the values of your team or organisation, or perhaps isn't the right fit for whatever reason, or the organisation isn't the right fit for them, how much of a negative impact that one person can have on the bigger picture is absolutely astounding. So not addressing that, even though that feels like a challenge, not calling that out, not like trying to find a solution to that, is much more problematic than just letting that play out, I feel.
Yeah, because it creates all kinds of simmering resentments and tensions that will impact every other aspect of your interaction with the rest of your team. If they don't, they'll lose respect for you if you don't tackle some of those things.
Absolutely.
One of the frustrations, and it is a huge frustration, we've discussed this privately many times. We possibly have discussed it on the podcast, but it's that thing of the bullies, the really poor leaders, often seemingly go longer and harder in their resolution to carry on as they are doing. And then what happens is the good people leave because of all the things we spoke about before. It's, you know, it's not right for them for their mental health or well-being, or for whatever reason, they decide they need to step out of the situation because it's not being tackled in any other way. How do we stop the drain of good people leaving organisations? Because it's that tipping point issue again, isn't it?
And we definitely have talked about this a lot privately, but I think we have talked about this a couple of times on the podcast as well. Oh, do you know what, Lee? If I had the answer to this question, I feel like
You'd
we
be a
would.
millionaire.
Well, it's not even about being a millionaire. I think we'd just have quite a lot of happier people working all around us in different organisations. Because I think the key bit for me is, I feel like probably the reason why most of those what we perceive to be good people leave and stop challenging the bullies and stop wanting to work in organisations where those bullies are going longer and harder, is that personal toll that it takes. Because I feel like you can be a person, you can be a leader, whatever, that, you know, really does want to challenge that poor behaviour, that toxic culture, that really wants to like go hard at it and make that positive change for your organisation. But if all you consistently come up against is resistance and attack and challenge back to you and being treated a certain way because you've dared to be that person potentially that challenges that bullying culture, that toxicity, there's only so long that you can keep going before you're just like, this is just exhausting. Like, it's too exhausting. I don't feel like I or my, maybe, because often what I found is there are probably a small cohort of people that feel the same way, that do want to do that challenge. You're never in isolation, actually. You are right. My experience has definitely been that. But those people just feel exhausted. So as much as you've maybe created a bit of a support network for yourselves of people who feel the same way and want to try and shift the dial and see some positive change in your organisation, if that dial doesn't shift even just a tiny bit, you get to the point where you go, I can't have an influence here in the way that I want to. And actually what's happening to me is I just feel exhausted. I've run out of energy. It's mentally draining. For my own personal good, I need to take myself out of this situation. And that's, if any of us could find the answer to that conundrum, I think we would be operating in such a different space when it comes to toxic culture and leadership. Absolutely. So I don't have the answer to that question, other than in my head I started thinking to myself, maybe an action, because we're definitely wanting to be about action, is creating some sort of support networks for these good leaders, these leaders who are in that space, who feel like they're consistently pushing against the tide of the bullies or the toxic behaviour, to come together and somehow at least seek some sort of support and realise that they're not the only ones in that space. But other than that, I was at a total loss, Lee, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it's hard. And I suppose we need to recognise, and I'm just going to say it, you know, the health service is one where we've seen time and time again the wrong types of leaders being rewarded and promoted into, you know, get moved on from an organisation because they are challenging. But the reward is they've moved on to a better or bigger job. And therefore they then set in and become part of the infrastructure in the institution, and then the role modelling begins, and so it continues.
Yeah.
And is that a political thing? You know, does it stem from the very centre and the ramifications of the way that behaves and the trickle down effect? I don't know. Do we need to have a clearer swipe of some of the infrastructure around how we govern some of these organisations, maybe? But I do, there needs to be more people calling it out, and I recognise that is hard to do.
And I think that's interesting, isn't it, that you said about how, you know, the governance and how we kind of regulate maybe some of this from a leadership point of view, because whatever sector you're in, whether it's healthcare or any another, a lot of the regulatory activity that happens is done by people who are in the sector already. So there's a lot of self-review or self-reflection, or, you know, you see this a lot in local government where they ask another local authority to come in and do a review of what's happening. But you're almost like, well, how independent is that if you're in the same sector where maybe this culture exists across organisations rather than just in one particular organisation? So there is something for me maybe there about that level of independence in terms of kind of reviewing how organisations are operating. And I absolutely get that people are like, well, I want it to be by people who understand what my sector provides. But actually, from a leadership point of view, I don't think it needs to be that. Like, it doesn't matter if you're running, you know, BP, an NHS organisation, a local authority, a political party, you know, an IT company. There are some principles of really good leadership and creating really positive cultures that will be the same regardless of what sector you work in. So actually, maybe there's some level of needing some sort of independent regulatory review of leadership rather than review of, you know, your sector. I don't know. It's just something that came to mind when you were talking about it.
Yeah. I mean, there have been talks, haven't there, about having some kind of, and I'm talking specifically about the NHS after some of the issues and scandals that have hit this year, about having some independent regulation of NHS managers, for example. But who's drawing that up?
Yeah.
The centre.
Yeah.
Made up of, not wholly, I will say, that's my disclaimer. You know, there are good people in every organisation, but there are definitely a few that reputationally are well known for not perhaps living the values that we would expect of forward thinking leaders. Anyway,
soapbox moment.
So to finish, I'm also really mindful of the personal toll of dealing with toxic leadership, and we've touched on this a little bit already. Firsthand, I've definitely had situations in my career where I've been triggered because of how a former leader has acted in certain situations, and then I sit in a similar situation with a different leader expecting the same outcome, and almost that fear, you know, you think you're back in that space and you respond and you realise actually there's a lot of baggage that you carry around with you if you've been in a situation where you've encountered that toxic workplace. And often we focus on the needs of an organisation to heal, and we'll look at culture development and how do we review and develop a different culture for an organisation where the leadership perhaps has not been great. But I don't often hear people talk about that individual impact and those that have perhaps been up close and personal with the stuff, and that they've got things they need to work through too. So I suppose my question is around, how do you start to recover? I'm not asking that personally. I've been on that journey, but this isn't a therapy session. But I suppose for people listening who may be like, actually, yeah, I do feel triggered sometimes in certain situations, and I hadn't quite put two and two together.
I think coaching and mentoring for me is key to this as an individual, finding those safe spaces to have the conversations that you might need to have, sometimes to uncover some of this, because it might be simmer in a way and you might, as you say, might not quite have put the two and two together yet to kind of work out what's going on for you. So I definitely think there's something there for me about having those safe spaces to have conversations and seek the support and gain the clarity you might need about what's happening for you, and then work through what you might be able to do to stop things triggering you once you've worked out what those triggers might be. And I will always go back to what we talk about in loads of different episodes of this podcast around your own support network. Like, have you got your trusted support network around you that can help you to work through some of this if you need to? So that would be my initial response to how you start to work through that recovery as an individual.
Yeah, I agree with both those points. I think for me, there was always part of the realisation was that the issue was never mine. It was always that other person's. It was their problem. It was how they behaved. There was something underlying in them that created that situation or that whatever. And so learning that what's in your control, what's out of your control, all of that was really, really helpful. And I think the other thing I found useful was being able to, so I agree, you need your support network, and that's perhaps where you do more of the offloading and the more frank discussions, but actually having open discussions with people. So for example, when I felt triggered by something that someone had done, which was completely not them, it was my baggage from a past experience, just saying to that person, look, I'm sorry I reacted in that way, or I'm sorry, I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable or a bit tense about this, but I just want to explain the context. You don't need to give them the life story. They might not, that might not be the space, but for them understanding why it might be uncomfortable to you, I think it just helps create that sense of, it builds that trust and connection with that new leader, and actually it can help you to recognise and appreciate what that other leader might be offering to you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good tip, isn't it? To that, like explaining the reason why you might react a certain way because you have been triggered is really important. And that's not just a work thing, is it? That's a life thing. And we probably find that easier to do in personal circumstances with partners or friends or relatives, to kind of go, oh God, I'm sorry, I reacted this way to that because this has happened to me before. But I'm not really sure we've ever created a workplace culture where it feels like that's important to do, but it really is, because it's all about people, isn't it? And building relationships with people, and that's no different whatever setting you're in. So I feel like that's really good advice, Lee. I might start to do that more myself. Thanks for that top tip.
You don't need to, like, every conversation. I'm feeling really triggered at the moment.
Well,
anyway, we have been talking for much longer than we should have, but it just goes to show that there is we could talk for hours on this topic, and I'm sure it's one that we're going to come back to time and time again, because I do know it's a real live issue for many people in organisations nowadays. So thank you, Carrie-Anne, for your contribution as always.
Thank you for creating a safe space for us to have this conversation, Lee.
I try. And until next week. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to hit follow to make sure you get the next episode. And if today's discussion resonated, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts.
We also have our Substack community where you can get behind the scenes info, ask us anything sessions, and build your network with like-minded leaders. Visit howtotakethelead.substack.com to find out more. And if you want to work with us to challenge and change leadership in your organisation, get in touch by dropping us an email, howtotakethelead@gmail.com, or DM us on the socials. Until next week, get out there and take the lead.